Hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcasts. We have a pretty much immediate reacts episode to what could possibly be a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. I say Lebanon, not Hezbollah, because they have been waging a war on all of Lebanese people indiscriminately. In fact, some of the worst bombing of Israel's air campaign has happened within the past few hours, leading up to the finalization, apparently, of a ceasefire proposal and the acceptance of the deal, which should play out at 10 a.m. local time, which I think is 4 a.m. for us here in the
Yep.
United States. But Joe Biden has announced a highly anticipated ceasefire to end the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in what he called a historic deal to end the 14-month-old war. And before we get to it, we are joined by regular contributors Matthew Enderline, former U.S. Army infantry officer currently living in Beirut, and Elena Xenofontos, a geopolitical analyst coming to us from London. Thanks so much for coming on last minute, y'all.
Thanks, Greg.
Good to be back.
All right. So the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, has endorsed an imminent ceasefire in the country's war with the Lebanese group after his full cabinet approved the deal earlier today, Tuesday evening, despite opposition from his far-right allies. Of course, Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich would never agree to that, but he has a little more sense, apparently, or a little bit more of his political survival instinct than his far-right ministers. So from which he draws his political power. So in a televised remarks after the Israeli Security Cabinet met to vote on the proposal for a 60-day ceasefire, Netanyahu said he was ready to implement the deal, but added that Israel would retain complete military freedom of action in the event of any infringement by Hezbollah. Quote, "We will enforce the agreement and respond forcefully to any violation. Together, we will continue until victory." So any violation, he said in his speech, would be constituted moving weapons from Syria into Lebanon, rearming, and refusing essentially to demilitarize. So that's a very shaky pretext. Then senior U.S. officials, if you weren't tracking this hectic timeline, immediately put out into the press that no, Israel will not have complete military autonomy inside Lebanon. So before the speech and the ceasefire proposal, Matt and I, you were talking about the unprecedented levels of bombing happening in Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and throughout southern Lebanon.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. In the past weeks, since the election, as you know, the rate and level of violence has increased, and that's reached a fever pitch in the past 24 hours, and especially today. It seems they've been using this announcement of the ceasefire and the backstop it has on them to be able to conduct these bombings as a reason to do a sort of spendex, if you will, on the entire country of Lebanon. They've targeted the Bekaa. I think over 50 people died in the Bekaa today. They've targeted all of the major coastal cities, and then in Beirut, witnessed expansion of the scope and the areas that they've attacked today. They've attacked several areas in central Beirut, and there were at least 3 strikes in Hamra, which is one of the historic and central neighborhoods of Beirut and home to the American University of Beirut, the National Bank. I mean, a lot of infrastructure, and the area where probably the majority or the largest number of displaced people are currently being housed. There was this afternoon, they leveled a building, an entire apartment building that was housing displaced people. And there was the largest, I think probably the largest bombing raid of the entire war today that was heard throughout the entire city in the region, where they hit over 20 targets with dozens of bombs all at once. And I think I sent you some video of that. It's really just like an incredible expansion of the violence and an attempt to try to feign or salvage any idea that they are in control of what's happening and that they've accomplished anything.
Right, and there's a second aspect of destroying financial infrastructure right before it ends that I
Yep.
want to ask Lena about here in a second. But yes, going for the military propaganda wins. I think earlier today we saw breaking out on IDF affiliated Telegram channels that they conducted this daring special operations raid into the Litani River. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Real quick, and here's what they posted. So we see, if you're listening, there's the closest point between Israel proper and the Litani River is a place called Metula. And essentially, they did a dismounted night raid out of Metula into southern Lebanon, into the region around the Litani River. And here's them walking. Here's the greater picture of Lebanon. Yes, they're walking in single file. That's not even. Oh, I thought it was a night raid. No, they just did a day raid.
It's just a straight up daytime patrol.
They did a daytime patrol in a place that wasn't really
they went
protected or defended.
a village called Dir Mimas, which is an Orthodox Christian village that has no Hezbollah presence and is not centered around any sort of tactical reason or any sort of the fighting. So the reason they did that was they just drew a line to the Litani River from the border and found, hey, where's the closest place? Since they failed to achieve any sort of lasting presence or meaningful territorial gains on the ground offensive since the beginning of the war.
So do you still have that blurb pulled up from The Guardian?
Or yeah, I could just paraphrase it. Yeah. So why did they do this? Because there's no military value. One, to make themselves feel good and to say that we crossed the Litani River, but also to show and try to put in the media the idea that they've gained some territory. So I found an article from The Guardian that said that the Israelis had launched daring raids across the Lebanese border into the Litani region, across the Litani River, in an attempt to shore up their ground offensive and their territorial, gains or whatever.
In the entire distance was like what 3.2 kilometers. If we were doing an offset silent clearance, that wouldn't even be far enough away to like not hear the helicopters come in. So that's an insanely small offset, by the way, for a dismounted patrol. Anyways, this is what they were doing in the church. Before we get into the real stuff, we should they had this really homophobic ceremony inside this Orthodox church.
Yeah.
Oh, the great Mary.
Who's marrying that? Okay, well, that's enough of that. So, okay, it's the same kind of maturity that we've come to expect from the Israeli Defense Force. Of course, if there was any Hezbollah presence in that town, they probably would have been acting differently. So, moving on. Again, we just wanted to show that video to kind of highlight that they're not serious people, and like not serious people, they have not attained any serious gains, except, however, the one contention that this ceasefire could be a strategic blunder for the Axis. But we'll get to that in a second. But just real quick, Elena, does the targeting of financial centers like currency exchange places, banks, is this part of their MO generally? Because I know that sustained bombing right before a ceasefire is called happened in 2006. It happens every time. So what do you think about all this?
But not bombing financial institutions are integral to any country's economy. I mean, especially a country like Lebanon, who is suffering immense sort of economic crisis and debt crisis, which has actually been worsening over the course of the last 4 to 5 years. I mean, essentially hitting their central financial institutions, it's a form of collective punishment that's going to have long-term impacts on the country as a whole going forward. And it also does set a dangerous precedent going forward, especially given the fact that if there's any sort of other escalation that's to occur, you could see Israel essentially bombing these financial institutions again, and because they're part of some of the core aspects of I guess, like, for civilian infrastructure in a way. This is how people send money. This is how people are able to buy goods, exchange goods, send money abroad, receive money from abroad. And again, these are people as well, particularly those who are internally displaced, that require this assistance, even from family abroad, to be able to get by. So by targeting these institutions, I mean, this is setting back Lebanon's financial state, and it's going to have impacts going forward. And I find it rather interesting that they've chosen to do something like that right before a ceasefire. I mean, fair enough, we've seen it before in 2006, that there's going to be a tad escalation, they're going to start bombing each other a little bit more intensely, but this is far beyond that point now. This is long-term damage. And to be quite honest with you, doesn't really look ideal in terms of sustaining a long-term, what they say is going to be a long-term ceasefire. That's just a quick version.
Well, yeah. So first of all, I was texting Matt a couple points earlier before we were getting ready for this reaction, but I wasn't able to download Netanyahu's speech to the Knesset. But essentially, he cites three main reasons for a ceasefire. Mm-hmm. He talks about fighting a 7-front war, destroying everything. He says, we're victorious, and given all the enemies stacked against us, you would have thought that this victory was something out of, quote, science fiction. And I'm like, kind of sounds like that to me. But anyways, he cites three reasons for accepting the ceasefire: to focus on the Iranian threat. Okay. And all he said after that was enough said.
Yeah.
2, to refresh the army forces and resupply. This is our point why this kind of looks like a blunder to accept it for Hezbollah from a strictly military perspective, to accept a ceasefire now. And 3, to disconnect the fronts and isolate Hamas. Those are the three main reasons why they're accepting it. And before we go back and look at that, let's just hear Joe Biden's speech. I'm going to be skipping around because he goes from everything from, October 7th atrocity propaganda all the way to Israel-Saudi normalization in a project for a new Middle East. We're not going to listen to the whole thing. It's 10 minutes, but we're going to hit some points. Here he is, Gramps, walking up to the podium.
Today, I have some good news to report from the Middle East. I just spoke with the Prime Minister of Israel and Lebanon. I'm pleased to announce that their governments have accepted the United States proposal to end the devastating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
At the time of this recording, we have not heard from Hezbollah. And their spokesperson said that they are reviewing the details to make sure there weren't any, quote, traps in the ceasefire proposal.
I want to thank President Macron of France for his partnership in reaching this moment. For nearly 14 months, a deadly conflict raged across the border that separates Israel and Lebanon. A conflict that began the day after the October 7 attack by Hamas on Israel. Hours later, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations backed by Iran attacked Israel in support of Hamas. Let's be clear, Israel did not launch this war. The Lebanese people did not seek that war either, nor did the United States. Over the past year, including the days immediately following October the 7th, I directed the U.S. military to flow assets and capabilities into the region, including aircraft carriers, fighter squadrons, and sophisticated air defense battery, to defend Israel and deter our common enemy at critical moments. Since the war with Hezbollah began, over 70,000 Israelis have been forced to live as refugees in their own country, helplessly watching their homes, their businesses, their communities as they're bombarded and destroyed. and over 300,000 Lebanese people have also been forced to live as refugees in their own country. And a war imposed on them by Hezbollah.
Okay. So, I mean, I would be remiss in saying that if a lot of people, and you were talking about this, Matt, a lot of people are pissed at Hezbollah within Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, if you segments of the population, yeah, I mean, Lebanon is already, regardless of everything that goes on outside it, has a deeply complicated political history, and they've got a lot of sectarian divisions, and just like any nation, lots of people in different groups don't agree, and even within a certain group, there may not be a consensus and disagree. But it seems there's research in the past couple of years indicates that up to 88, I think, percent of Shia Muslims in Lebanon strongly support Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, if you look to the last elections in 2022 in Lebanon, they received over 350,000 ballots out of a total of 1.5 million, I think, which is the largest number of any political party by over 150,000 votes. And yeah, so in certain segments of society, they are deeply supported, and in other segments of society, they are not. But they are a part of the society, the government, the cultural and economic landscape in Lebanon, and their presence extends far beyond weapons and military matters. They're a political party, and they are part of, as much as Joe Biden and Netanyahu would like them to go away, they are a part of the government and the country here.
And so, when I'm looking at this, and why, and I guess they are trying to be a part of the government and not supersede it, which is why I guess that the Lebanese government, which some people call it a caretaker government, at least that's how the Cradle media is referring to the Lebanese government as a, quote, caretaker government. Do you see that, Elena, as a reason why Hezbollah has kind of like been taking a back seat in terms of like the PR and like speaking directly to the ceasefire negotiations?
Look, this is the thing. When you're talking about Lebanon, you have to understand sort of the former colonial past and the impact that it's had on society in Lebanon as a whole. I mean, the entire fraction of Lebanese society rooted in like sort of religious identity, which is rather predominant in that part of the world, including the country where I come from. Again, it's rooted in sort of this colonial mindset that was created at the time. And even the mandate for Lebanon that established its constitution, I mean, the very idea of having a prime minister that's particular of the Maronite community and establishing these sort of hierarchies, it's always created internalized conflict. And what's essentially happening in Lebanon now, and what I think Israel has been trying to accomplish, and the West has been trying to accomplish systematically, and we've been seeing this gradually over the course, especially of the last 5-6 months, is that they're trying to trigger like the sort of internalized dichotomies within Lebanon, so as to target Hezbollah from within, and therefore sort of alleviating that sort of burden from Israel and allowing the Lebanese community itself to sort of turn against each other. Hezbollah is trying to navigate that so as to not upset the overall, I guess, sentiment within Lebanese society, and therefore trying to work with the Lebanese sort of government, if you would like to call it a government, but as we established, it's inherently problematic. And honestly, the entire Lebanese constitution needs to be altered, but that's a whole different conversation. But they're trying to navigate that in order to sort of prevent the sort of internal civil strife that could be detrimental to Lebanon and to the resistance as a whole. But ultimately, my personal belief in this particular given situation, I even think that with the so-called ceasefire, because I mean, you'd mentioned earlier that I can't remember which senior official from Hezbollah had basically said that they need to review the to make sure that the conditions that Israel agreed to are the same conditions that Lebanon has agreed to. Because according to what's coming out of Hezbollah, like some of the statements that they've made, they haven't confirmed anything, but the statements that they have made is that they're concerned that there's been discrepancies as to what's been offered to Lebanon, or what Hezbollah may have somewhat agreed to through the Lebanese state, and what Israel has agreed to. And so the point that I'm trying to make, where Hezbollah is there trying its best to navigate both being a resistance faction and trying to support Gaza and the Palestinian movement, they're also trying to navigate sustaining sort of a sense of harmony so much as is possible within Lebanon. However, even now, again, we don't have all the information. It's looking as though, if this is indeed true, right, if there is some sort of discrepancy, it would allude to the fact that this is like they're trying to use those internal frictions to try to create problems within Lebanon. This is what it's looking like to me. And although Hezbollah is trying to navigate that so far as is possible, it will become increasingly difficult, because we can see how the United States, France, and Israel are trying to turn the Lebanese people against each other. To what extent that shall be successful is a bit of a different story.
Right. And so let's hear the actual. We're only going to listen to half this speech because, well, it's mostly like the second half is about creating a new Middle East and Saudi Israel normalization. But here are the specifics that President Biden spoke to.
All told, this has been which were prepared for an October 7 style terrorist attack. Lasting security for the people of Israel and Lebanon cannot be achieved only on the battlefield. And that's why I directed my team to work with the governments of Israel and Lebanon to forge a ceasefire, to bring the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah to a close. Under the deal reached today, effective at 4 a.m. tomorrow local time, the fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end. Will end. This is designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities. What is left of Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations will not be allowed, well, I emphasize, will not be allowed to threaten the security of Israel again.
Good luck with that.
Over the next 60 days, the Lebanese army and state security forces will deploy and take control of their own territory once again. Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure in southern Lebanon will not be allowed to be rebuilt. And over the next 60 days, Israel will gradually withdraw its remaining forces. And civilians on both sides will soon be able to safely return to their communities and begin to rebuild their homes, their schools, their farms, their businesses,
their freaking banks,
and their very lives. We're determined this conflict will not be just another cycle of violence. And so the United States, with the full support of France and our other allies, has pledged to work with Israel and Lebanon to ensure that this arrangement is fully implemented, the agreement totally implemented. You know, there will be no U.S. troops deployed in southern Lebanon. This is consistent with my commitment to the American people to not put U.S. troops in combat in this conflict. Instead, we, along with France and others, will provide the necessary assistance to make sure this deal is implemented fully and effectively. Let me be clear. If Hezbollah or anyone else breaks the deal and poses a direct threat to Israel, then
of course Israel's not mentioned in that.
Israel retains the right to self-defense,
which it does not have under international law. Well, I mean, that's more debatable when it comes to Palestine. But anyways, moving on.
Consistent with international law, just like any country, when facing a terrorist group pledged to that country's destruction. At the same time, this deal supports Lebanon's sovereignty, and so it heralds a new start for Lebanon.
Essentially, what they're talking about, and then he gets into Saudi normalization and how that will stabilize the Middle East, and then Israel and Saudi Arabia can finally come out of the closet and be friends in the sunlight. So I suppose what we're looking at and what everything I've read so far is a tripartite like kind of coalition or security operation between like France, the United States, the Lebanese government, and you have some experience with this, Matt, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I have some experience in working in border regions, but not specifically with any sort of implementation of any sort of major international agreement. I can say that essentially this agreement is based off of and similar in a lot of ways to UN Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 war, which was implemented partially, but never fully implemented. And the enforcement mechanism, what it seems like they will establish some sort of independent, probably joint military observer sort of entity, similar to what the U.S. started and other nations in the Sinai in Egypt to enforce the 1980, I believe, peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. But again, a lot of that's going to fall on the UN mission, which is already there and already tasked with enforcing that agreement that doesn't really exist anymore. And of course, Israel has continually targeted and attacked and wounded several of them. In addition to Lebanese military, they've attacked it at several positions, kind of deep into Lebanese territory. Bringing the Lebanese army to enforce that is going to be a probably pretty precarious operation. I think it's something that a role that they have not played in a large role, in recent history. But the bottom line at the end of the day is that the agreement can be implemented. It can work, but it's entirely dependent on both organizations not restarting and escalating hostilities.
And one of the issues is that I see is that based off of Netanyahu's speech, they could just manufacture a reason to do it because, of course, the U.S. doesn't question them, and there's mounting internal pressure within Israel to like get the settlers back to the north, but not enough to unseat or stop Netanyahu or stop the war machine. So that's definitely one concern. Also, another one is we're just coming in again from the cradle is that like all the official crossings from Syria into Lebanon have been destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. Homs in Syria has been bombed, and now that they've stopped, they're going to stop dropping Lebanon. I think they're going to shift aerial operations into Syria as well, and so that I don't think when people say this is a ceasefire, I'm like, well, not in the context of the entire theater of operations. They're shifting priorities now. I don't think they have any intention of stopping the violence in any meaningful way. Now, Alina, before we were coming up with the real premise of this operation, you made the observation that you don't really get why, from a strategic perspective, like Hezbollah would be accepting a ceasefire now, especially with the Israeli army on the brink. Like literally, the Washington Post, a very sympathetic to Israel publication, published a piece yesterday that I used in my Mint Press live stream about how like there was desertions, like over 50% desertions within special operations units. Like they can't. Small businesses are closing. The economy is in a spiral. So from our perspective, we're like, why would you stop? Why would you stop?
Exactly. This was what doesn't really make any sense and what I found most interesting. So on the one hand, you have the Israeli economy, which is really and truthfully on the brink of collapse. This is something that, like you said, was pretty much established in Israeli media, Haaretz being one of the mainstream sort of media outlets in Israel that have also published papers along these lines. But even the Times of Israel and then also the Washington Post and the New York Times have gone on extensive sort of pieces, have written extensive pieces, sort of just dissecting the dire state of the Israeli economy. I mean, we knew several months months ago, this like 6 or 7 months ago, that the Israeli economy had actually essentially contracted by 20%. I mean, and we still don't even know the exact figures and numbers, because a lot of this information is being concealed for obviously strategic purposes from Israel's perspective. And we do know, like, their construction industry is closing down. Small to medium-sized businesses, around 40,000 of them have been essentially shut down. The strain of the internalized displaced, which I find funny, internally displaced Israelis that are essentially being housed in hotels, etc., which is obviously costing the country a lot of money. But even when it comes to foreign direct investment into Israel, into other industries, including sort of like their the more high-tech and surveillance-based industries, have somewhat obviously reduced. And I remember those certain numbers, which I can't recall at this particular point in time. So we're seeing that the Israeli economy, which is a small economy, it's a small country, is being gradually depleted. And at the same time, even by the words of Netanyahu in his speech to the, basically, I think it was earlier today, he had said, I mean, there's also an issue with regards to ammunition, basically shortage in ammunition, weapons, military. They have a shortage of manpower. I mean, you have Israel right now where you would kind of want them. They're broken. You have many of their sort of reservists that are refusing to go back to fight, like you pretty much outlined. We also don't even have an accurate number as to how many have been wounded and will no longer be able to actually go back into combat, in addition to those that are killed, because again, there's a gag order on this information in order obviously to preserve their intelligence information as a whole. So you have Israel at a particular point that is incredible, that it's actually incredibly the weakest Israel has ever been in its history. And apparently now Hezbollah agrees to terms and conditions that would essentially allow Israel the space of at least 2 months to rejuvenate, because that's essentially what's going to happen, economically, militarily, actually build up its military stockpiles and inventory, which there's another aspect to that as well, which has to do with the overall totality of like Western stockpile ammunition issues as well as a whole, because there are multiple fronts that are occurring right now globally that they have to obviously be able to provide for. So that comes into play as well. So you have Hezbollah apparently agreeing to give, allegedly, there's going to be this ceasefire for a period of 60 days. From what I understand, the Israeli military is going to be in Lebanon and gradually withdrawing within that 60-day period, or maybe after the 60-day period. I'm not quite certain. I don't know if you guys are more onto the detail there. Is it within the 60 days? They don't have very far to go. Yeah, well, that's true. So but I mean, you still have meters to walk. But that's true. They're going to be basically they're going to remain in Lebanon for, I guess, in the territories that they can anyway, for a period of 60 days, requesting that Hezbollah is essentially going to become somewhat isolated, to put pressure on the Lebanese state and the Lebanese military to make sure that that particular area underneath the Litani River is no longer going to become militarized. And we do know that there's been obviously the particular bombings on key routes between Syria and Lebanon that were fundamental to Hezbollah's sort of military and ammunition sort of, I guess, transportation. So obviously this does create a problem for Hezbollah. But still, right now Hezbollah is in a particular position where Israel is incredibly weak. This is what the main, I guess, issue that I have is here. And by allowing Israel even a couple of weeks or a couple of months to sustain a so-called ceasefire, by which it will allow Israel to gather itself, organize itself militarily, by which then it retains the right to react if Hezbollah is found breaking any one of the terms and conditions, which could very well be, I don't know, building infrastructure in the south of Lebanon, that will then allow them to basically reinstigate against hostilities in Lebanon again. And what's important here is, in my opinion, of course, always, is that at the end of the day, when you're looking at it from an anti-imperialist perspective, the axis of resistance is significant in obviously pushing back against the imperial powers that are trying to obviously dominate the region, right? So Hezbollah, in a way, is the vanguard for that. They have been at the forefront of this struggle. And so if you want to deplete the axis of resistance, you have to get rid of Hezbollah. So eventually, sooner or later, if it's not in a month, it's going to be in 2 months, Israel's going to find some particular opportunity to target Hezbollah again in the south of Lebanon. And when they do, they will come back in full force, with greater power because they have been given the space to breathe, whilst at the same time, we've given them the opportunity to start isolating Hamas in Gaza, which is already struggling significantly because at the end of the day, they've been fighting now for over a year and a half in very dire conditions. And that is what I find very problematic in this, because essentially you're giving Israel the space to organize and mobilize in a way that is going to boomerang back onto Hezbollah and Lebanon, because they're not done with Lebanon yet. They're just buying time.
And also, here's the second consideration. Who's president in 2 months?
Oh, yes. Our friend Trump, our beloved friend Trump, who as well, he also has an agenda towards Iran. And that's the other thing here. There is an agenda to deal with Iran. The axis is pretty much the buffer between the West and Iran at this point, which is another reason why you would want to tackle Israel right now and not allow for Israel to become more emboldened and therefore be able to strike it, because they will strike the axis of resistance again because they want to get to Iran. And we know that Trump has made it very clear his position when it comes to Iran. He has a very hostile, the entirety of the establishment in the United States has a hostile relationship with Iran, which is why, again, to me, this is going to be a strategic blunder if they have indeed agreed to provide Israel with this space, unless, truthfully, and this is the only clause I can give in this situation, Hezbollah itself needs to reorganize and replenish. And so this becomes, I guess, something that they need for themselves.
Yeah. Matt, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, they certainly do. And in my opinion, Hezbollah would benefit more than Israel with 2 months to refit and reorganize their forces, just because the Israelis, by virtue that they have the backing of Western powers and the money that their logistic capabilities to sustain and refit their forces as they fight are generally higher than Hezbollah would have. And I think your opinions and your analysis are spot on with the thinking. If the thinking that this does not turn into a permanent ceasefire, or at least permanent for this particular iteration of this conflict, of course, it doesn't end. If you start to look at it, if you look at it as temporary, and you think that's true, then it starts to not make sense. But by the same token, what we're asking about, why would Hezbollah agree to a ceasefire when Israel is on their heels, when they're clearly hitting the end of the rope in terms of public support, in terms of just ammunition supplies and whatnot, is that Hezbollah still, with all they've done and all the capabilities they've built, they still have a limited offensive capability compared to an army like the IDF. So from a military sense, yes, you are right. You would want to move forward and capitalize on that situation. However, especially at this point, Hezbollah does not really have the offensive capability to do any sort of ground maneuver of any significance inside northern occupied Palestine. And they have certainly suffered some losses. However, they've been, since the first part of the conflict, where they were caught a little bit and their activity level slowed down, they've demonstrated that despite all of the fighting and all of these losses, that their capability does still exist and has bounced back. A few days ago, within the last week, they clocked 51 distinct operations in a single day, which is the largest amount of operations they've conducted since October 7th of last year. They've proven throughout this conflict that despite what they've endured, that they've been able to reach farther and target deeper into Israeli territory. But the thing that it comes down to for this, and why I think Hezbollah would agree to the ceasefire, is they have not been sufficiently able to capitalize on their advantage over the Israelis in the ground fight, simply because Israel has not committed to the ground fight in my opinion, because they know that it just leads to loss and embarrassment for them. So despite the fact that they, at the beginning of this war, massed and mobilized 3 divisions along the border, we've not seen them do any sort of significant offensive operation with a large force. Everything they've done is piecemeal, small patrols, taking small parts of villages at a time. They had one penetration that went in just a few kilometers that they have since withdrawn from. They've struggled to fight and take territory, even in the villages along the border. And they're doing that a bit, in my opinion, intentionally, because they know that they lose that fight. That this, as soon as they go in, that's the mistake they made in 2006. So they've really leaned onto the air assets and the bombing campaigns with attempt to, targeting mostly civilian infrastructure in an attempt to just wear down the will of the people to support the resistance. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think if they could capitalize on that, then they would. But I think this ceasefire for them, I think, allows them to preserve the victory and the true purpose of their, this iteration and their participation in the resistance since October 7th, which you could look at as a kind of, a shaping operation to the main resistance and the fighting in Gaza that developed after October 7th. And what have they accomplished with that? They've displaced, as Biden said, 70,000 people. That's caused a huge impact, I'm sure, to the economy, to the confidence of the people, because it shows that Israel cannot protect it despite all of its weapons, technological advancements, and money and support from the Imperial Western governments. It cannot protect its citizens inside its territory. It cannot allow them to live in their homes. So with this ceasefire, that benefit and that victory is preserved for them, and they're allowed to regroup and prepare for the next iteration.
Also, sometimes Netanyahu says the quiet part out loud. They need time to rearm. Like, literally, they couldn't do anything without Western backing.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like, this is where my biggest point is, because the very purpose of Hezbollah sort of entering this war to begin with was a supportive front for Gaza. So obviously to stretch the Israeli army thin so that the Palestinian resistance can better be able to handle the Israeli occupation forces as they're obviously coming into Gaza. Now, obviously, from what I understand, there is obviously been an erosion as well of the resistance in Palestine. It has been in Gaza. It has been about over a year now, and obviously within very dire conditions. I think Hezbollah pulling out in the way that they are now. Well, it's not really pulling out. Of course, they've done a great deal, and to the detriment of the Lebanese people. And this has to always be remembered. Hezbollah has done the most, and we must always respect that. But if they were to pull out now, which is what I guess is we're being told, when you start looking at the general image of the axis of resistance as a whole, it starts to look somewhat problematic. It does put it's going to put a lot of pressure on Gaza. It means that Israel will do as it says it wants to, which is actually to put a lot of pressure on Hamas, to put a lot of pressure on the Palestinian resistance, to obviously get their hostages back, as if they really care about the hostages. But it's mostly to try to, at the very least, break the Palestinian resistance so as to change the rules of the game, and sort of their negotiating power, which up until this point, Hamas was able to maneuver with more, I guess, confidence. Now, if things go according to the way Israel plans to, this could really change the negotiating power towards Israel's favor, because they'll be able to zone in on Gaza in even much more aggressively than what they already have. And so when this happens, the overall image of the axis as well will start to look somewhat weakened, as if they somewhat failed the original objective, which was to provide that support in order to get that ceasefire for Gaza first. Because the idea was there will only be a ceasefire in Lebanon if there was a ceasefire in Gaza, which is the whole idea of all the fronts coming together. Now there's been the separation of the fronts, which is rather demoralizing. And then at the end of the day, it's not over between Israel and Hezbollah. That's the thing. They're going to go after Hezbollah again anyway, because they need to. Because like you said, they haven't actually established security for Israel at all. The whole idea of Israel being this a military powerhouse and all its citizens are protected, that's been essentially evaporated, especially for the citizens of northern Israel, who I was reading even Israeli media outlets today. They were essentially, many of them, especially the mayors of the north, were essentially stating that they don't even want the ceasefire because they don't feel safe, because they do not view Hezbollah as being defeated, and they has not been defeated. So they are very aware that this could be something that escalates again, which therefore exposes the 70,000, 100,000 Israelis to the same sort of dangers and circumstances as we've seen before. And the fact of the matter is, going back to what I was trying to say, when they say they're going to deal with Iran, they mean they're going to deal with the entire axis. So whatever happens, and there's going to be another sort of escalation with Hezbollah, and that's what that is what where I have a bit of where I'm sort of still trying to come to an understanding about it is, it's just going to be a temporary situation. Israel's going to try to empower itself, replenish itself, but we will be back at this again, and probably much sooner than anticipated. And we also would have abandoned Gaza for a particular period of time, which might allow Israel the space to get what it wants out of Gaza. I guess this is where I'm perplexed.
You know, that you do bring up a good point, because it is hard to imagine a situation if as Netanyahu states that they do intend to escalate things against Iran. It's hard to imagine a situation where they are escalating in a meaningful way operations against Iran, and Hezbollah not getting involved in that, and staying silent by while Iran is attacked. That situation is kind of hard to imagine.
You know, I guess my overall impression is this thing is propped up by like really shaky stilts. Like it could go sideways at any moment.
I'm of the opinion that I think that this has been set up, because I'm really confused by some of the statements that are coming out of some members of Hezbollah, saying that they're sort of distrust now as to what has been agreed upon. There seems to be a bit of a chaotic mess surrounding this. We're going to find out more tomorrow, obviously, as the story progresses. But that in of itself is rather alarming. And what I believe, and this is just my personal opinion, right, based on information, this could change by tomorrow, and my opinion might change by tomorrow based on the information that's going to come out. But I believe that this is basically looks a bit more to me like it's going to be a setup that eventually they're going to find a means by which to blame the breaking of a ceasefire agreement on Hezbollah, and then they're going to initiate further attacks on Lebanon anyway, because they do want to target the axis. They do need to eliminate it. They're probably going to focus a bit on Syria, because as well, Netanyahu was threatening Assad again today. So the idea is that I think they want to try, they're going to go back after the acts of resistance. They're just maybe going to provide a bit of a breathing space to allow them the ability to maneuver, but it's going to happen far quicker than we anticipate, probably in a matter of weeks. It might even fail by tomorrow. I'm not even quite certain. And the idea is to then blame the escalation that's going to turn against the entirety of the axis or against Lebanon. It's going to be blamed on the axis itself, on Iran, and we're going to be back at that same sort of rhetoric. And what we're going to be seeing with regards as well to like the Lebanese armed forces, the reason they weren't able to implement the resolution 1701 is because they don't even have the capability, the military capability to combat Hezbollah. Hezbollah is actually far more powerful than the Lebanese armed forces. So now what we're seeing is basically like France coming in, saying, and the totality of the West, like the Western allies, saying that they're going to arm and really sort of fuel the Lebanese armed forces so that they can counter Hezbollah. And this is why I'm sort of leaning back to the idea that they kind of want Hezbollah to falter. They're going to trigger Hezbollah to falter, or find an excuse that Hezbollah has faltered so as to then attack and then provide the sort of ammunition necessary to go back into Lebanon, but also probably to try and arm the Lebanese armed forces and create some sort of civil conflict that will break Hezbollah, because they absolutely need Hezbollah destroyed if they're going to go after Iran. They absolutely do. And then they will continue that mission in Syria, and wherever there's the axis, they will go after it, because otherwise they won't be able to accomplish their agenda, which is essentially taking control effectively over all of Western Asia, which is so important when it comes to, the geopolitical economy and sustaining sort of imperial control because of their trade routes, their resources. It's vital. And right now they don't have control over this vital area.
Yeah, and that's why we didn't play it for you, because it was a 9-minute speech. But the second half of Biden's speech was all about normalization with Saudi Arabia in order to, quote, re-envision a new Middle East of peace and prosperity for all, which means, the comprador governments and, the Western interests.
Well, the United States has hobbled any nuance to its foreign policy possibilities in the Middle East in the last year with their entire and complete support of Israel. So at this point, they have wasted and soured every sort of diplomatic relation or every ounce of trust with not only the people but all of the institutions and governments throughout the Middle East. So there's very little hope of any sort of normalization for any relations that will benefit the U.S. that doesn't involve using Israel as a conduit. And now they have to put all of their eggs in one basket. And I think we'll see in general the tide of foreign policy in the Middle East kind of center around, as if it didn't already. But I think all sort of nuance and all sort of illusion that they're trying to create any sort of parity between diplomatic relations between the governments in the Middle East will disappear, and they can only benefit by supporting and increasing their support to Israel. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous for not just U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It's dangerous for our foreign policy around the world. It's a dangerous game they're playing, and it's it's just removing all their options.
Yeah, and again, we're going to see the continual degradation of United States soft power now that we're
Sure.
more increasingly tethered to what is increasingly becoming a pariah state. Just had the ICC warrants issued last week. You're seeing this horrendous bombing campaign happen, moments leading up to a ceasefire. It's not a good look.
No, it's not.
Yeah, and I think this idea as well, I think we've discussed this before, this idea of normalization at this point with Saudi Arabia, it's really just, there's no strong base for it anymore. I mean, Saudi Arabia, it's playing both fields at this point. It's strategically looking after itself, as Saudi Arabia would always do at the end of the day. It doesn't really have loyalties outside of its own financial gains and interests. But that's the thing, its own financial gains and interests no longer lie specifically anyway with the United States or even Israel. They have other options. They want to diversify their economy. They want to diversify their allies and trading partners. I mean, even though they haven't officially become a part of BRICS, like the jure part of BRICS, de facto they're acting as though that they're part of BRICS in many, many ways. And even when it comes to the idea of normalizing, initially, I mean, several years ago, this, I guess, was somewhat appealing when they were in an antagonistic relationship with Iran, but that has somewhat changed, meaning that the whole overall dynamic of I guess their relationship with the region is somewhat altering very gradually. I mean, even recently they announced, I think it was at the BRICS summit or a little bit before, no, it's actually during the BRICS summit, that they're even executing now sort of naval operations in conjunction with Iran. I mean, that's rather historic given their recent history, that now their relationship has improved so drastically in just the space of a year since they signed the peace, like sort of came to these peace agreements just in April of 2023. And so, and then the other aspect as well behind something never ever gets discussed nowhere near as much as is necessary is that the idea of having even this normalization with Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia also wanted guarantees beyond security guarantees with the United States. It was also about nuclear capabilities and providing Saudi Arabia with nuclear capabilities, which is something that Israel and many in Israel were sort of vehemently against. And there was even a lot of pieces that were coming out of Haaretz even last year before October 7th, and I would agree with them on this, that if this was to happen, if Saudi Arabia was to give in sort of nuclear capabilities, we'll be looking at the sort of nuclear arms race in the Middle East, which then brings another bouts of danger to the entire region. So there's all these other issues. And then obviously then there's the issue of Palestine itself that does create a lot of internal sort of issues within the general region as a whole, as in within the civilian population. I just don't find it feasible anymore. I mean, Saudi Arabia has other options. They don't need this normalization to take place if it's going to also be at its detriment at this point. But obviously the United States needs to, I feel like Biden's constant rhetoric about this is to sort of provide this idea that the West still has a particular sort of influence that it doesn't have in the way it used to. This is not to say that it doesn't have influence. It absolutely does. But that there has been a change to the status quo, but they can't seem to accept that. They need to still put this image of we are still who we were for the public. But it's not really, I think, feasible.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is however long this ceasefire lasts, whether or not it pans out to be a strategic blunder or a strategic gain, the Western involvement in the Middle East has changed irrevocably forever. Unprecedented times, Saudi Arabia, there's all this talk about it normalizing with Israel, but because of what's been happening, it's also kind of normalizing with Iran in some ways as well. Relationships are repairing, and that's an unintended consequence of putting all our eggs in one basket, as Matt referred to, into the basket of Israel, which is currently alienating the majority of the population of the MENA countries. West Asia, and North Africa. And, those governments are terrified of like an Arab Spring 2.0. It's been massively destabilizing. Kind of hard to imagine where it goes from now, but like U.S. image is forever soured in that region. If Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Yemen and Syria didn't do it well, like it's so public and it was so bad this time.
Yeah.
Also looking completely impotent in the face of Israeli aggression, unable to curtail it when Benjamin Netanyahu himself said they couldn't fight without U.S. aid. It's just all absurd. I think, but then again, they'll never prop it up this way. We're going to look at Hezbollah and they're going to be like, yeah, we defeated Hezbollah. Hell yeah. And then, of course, the United States associated media outlets will, also provide political cover and talk about how like Hezbollah is really on the ropes and they can never recover. Not true. And here's the one salient thing. I might just title the episode this: Empire never narrates its own decline. But there's no recovering from this within West Asia for U.S. foreign policy.
No. And they've also discredited all their institutions that they created in order to sustain sort of like the political aspect of, I guess, imperialism, essentially. Like all the United Nations institutions, have been completely discredited. Even their approach towards the ICC sort of arrest warrants. It's just essentially destroying everything that you've created. But again, it just goes back to the idea of desperation as well, of trying to control and sort of sustain global hegemony. This is what's happening, because otherwise, if they don't, and I've said this before, they have to share power that then doesn't allow them to exploit in the same way. Particularly, we talk about the multinational corporations and the elite ruling class that essentially define the political state in the U.S. It's not really the political class; it's just pretty much the performative class for the financial owners of the United States at this point. So, I mean, this is the state of the U.S. at the moment, and just generally the entirety of the West. And frankly, yeah, with regards to what's going to happen in Lebanon, we're just going to have to wait and see. But my personal belief is this is going to be very short-lived. And I think within weeks, if it does go through, we're going to see an escalation. It's going to be pinned on Hezbollah again. And they're going to go full force in. And the idea at the end of this is Iran. That's the final point here.
And Syria is going to get hit harder now.
Oh, yeah, Syria. Yeah.
So, all right, y'all. We are at the end of the time. Strategic blunder or not, the U.S. is losing out, and Israel will not be able to recover long term. What it means for the conflicts within West Asia, unclear at this time. Again, the ceasefire is tenuous at best. Again, we haven't heard an official response from Hezbollah as of 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we're going to go ahead and publish this real quick. Thanks, y'all, so much for coming on. Matt, stay safe in Beirut. And
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, be safe.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. And then, see you guys after Thanksgiving, unless something crazy happens tomorrow. Actually, on Mint Press News, I am interviewing an Iranian journalist, I believe. I have to check with my editor on that, but it's going to be more about Hezbollah's position ideologically about this ceasefire. So check us out on that. I might repost to Colonial Outcast because the Mint Press account is just so horrendously shadow banned. It's not even funny. Almost 80,000 subs and gets 6,000 views. So anyways, yeah, it's bad. We get so much more engagement here on Colonial Outcast. But anyways, be looking out for that. And so that should be pretty interesting. So again, thanks guys for coming on, and we'll see you on the next one.